With his raw Harlem swagger, ripped sweatshirts, and gravity-defying leaps, he was the explosive heartbeat of the 80s hit fame. But while millions watched the invincible Leroy dance, Hollywood secretly watched Gene Anthony Ray die. As AIDS hollowed out his body, ruthless executives didn't offer medicine. They just plastered thick makeup over his sinking face to squeeze out one last profitable spin. When his dying legs finally collapsed, they orchestrated a brutal cover-up. To protect their franchise, they branded their bleeding star a worthless junkie, locked the studio gates, and threw the boy who taught the world to dance onto a freezing park bench to die penniless and alone. Gene Anthony Ray was born on May 24, 1962. He did not arrive quietly, and he never lived quietly. Raised in the concrete labyrinth of Harlem, New York by his mother Jean, his early life was stripped of privilege. There were no polished dance studios, no classical piano accompaniments, and certainly no money for expensive ballet tuition. His training ground was the hot asphalt. His rhythm was dictated by the heavy bass of neighborhood block parties and the chaotic noise of the city streets. He danced because he had to. It was his voice. It was a physical rebellion against an environment designed to keep a young, impoverished black boy entirely invisible. He was brilliant, but he was feral. By the time he hit his teens, Gene was a tightly coiled spring of kinetic energy and deep-seated anti-authoritarianism. He actually won a place at the Real High School of Performing Arts in Manhattan, the exact institution that would later form the backdrop of his global fame. It should have been his golden ticket. Instead, it was a brutal collision of two entirely incompatible worlds. The school demanded compliance. They wanted straight lines, measured breathing, and classical technique. They wanted him to tame his instincts. Gene refused. He was a lad who danced from his gut, translating raw emotion into furious, unpolished movement. He challenged instructors. He swore. He ignored the dress codes and defied the rigid syllabus. He wasn't just acting out, he was fundamentally allergic to their institutional control. The school looked at a once-in-a-generation talent and decided he was simply too much trouble. After just one turbulent year, they expelled him. They threw him back onto the streets. He enrolled in a standard, rough, comprehensive school, Julia Richmond High. His prospects abruptly narrowed. The spark could have easily died right there, suffocated by the daily grind of inner-city survival. But in 1979, the trajectory of his life violently snapped in a new direction. British film director Alan Parker was in New York, hunting for the cast of a new gritty musical drama called Fame. Parker was actively avoiding the polished plastic stage school kids. He wanted authenticity. He set up massive open auditions, pulling in thousands of desperate, hopeful teenagers from across the 5 boroughs. Gene was skiving off school that day. He had no agent, no headshot, and no prepared routine. He simply tagged along with some mates to the audition, treating the whole circus as a bit of a laugh. When it was his turn to face the panel, the contrast was absolute. The casting directors had spent hours watching nervous kids perform neat, choreographed, highly rehearsed routines. Then Gene stepped up. He didn't ask for a piano accompanist. He demanded they put on a record with a heavy, driving beat. Then he exploded. He didn't perform. He attacked the air. He threw his body across the room with a desperate, aggressive joy. It was Harlem street dance, totally unfiltered, shoved directly into the faces of the Hollywood elite. His lines were messy, his technique was non-existent by classical standards, but his charisma was blinding. He commanded the room with a ferocious, magnetic arrogance. Alan Parker and choreographer Louis Falco stopped dead. They knew instantly what they were looking at. They didn't just give Gene a part, they essentially tore up the script. They rebuilt the character of Leroy Johnson entirely around the boy standing in front of them. The rebellion, the expulsion, the raw, unlettered genius. They stripped Gene's actual life bare and monetized it. That audition was the turning point. It was the moment a brilliant, untamed street kid caught the eye of the corporate entertainment machine. The executives looked at his explosive talent and saw pure, unadulterated profit. They handed a teenage high school dropout a contract, instantly plunging him into a ruthless, high-stakes industry. They secured their star, and in doing so laid the very first invisible brick of his eventual destruction. The 1980 release of the film Fame hit the cultural landscape like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just a movie, it was a sudden seismic shift in youth culture. And dead in the center of the poster, the undisputed focal point of the entire phenomenon, was Gene Anthony Ray. When audiences sat in darkened cinemas and watched the infamous Hot Lunch Jam cafeteria scene, they were witnessing the birth of an icon. That sequence wasn't just acting. It was an unscripted, visceral explosion of Gene's actual Harlem-bred energy onto celluloid. He leaped onto the tables in his baggy tracksuit bottoms and a raggedly cut sweatshirt, and he completely obliterated the polite, classical boundaries of screen dancing. He danced with a furious, aggressive joy that felt entirely dangerous and completely intoxicating. Almost overnight, the world decided it wanted to look like Leroy Johnson. Teenagers across the globe, from the housing estates of London to the suburbs of Sydney, took scissors to their clothes, ripping the collars off their sweatshirts to expose a shoulder. Leg warmers, previously restricted to chilly rehearsal studios, became standard streetwear. Gene didn't just play a character, he inadvertently launched a global fashion empire. He was 18 years old, entirely unprepared, and suddenly one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. The film was a massive critical and commercial success, winning 2 Academy Awards. But in the boardrooms of Hollywood, executives at MGM didn't just see a successful film. They saw a highly scalable product. They realized that the hunger for this specific brand of high-energy, aspirational youth culture was insatiable. They decided to strip mine it. In 1982, Fame was rebooted as a weekly television series. This was the moment the trap truly snapped shut around Gene. Making the transition from a feature film to a weekly television show in the 1980s was a brutal industrial process. A film shoots perhaps 2 pages of a script a day, allowing time for rest, rehearsal, and physical recovery. A weekly hour-long musical television show was an entirely different beast. It was a relentless assembly line. Gene was handed a contract. He was young, he had grown up with nothing, and he had absolutely no concept of entertainment law. He didn't have high-powered agents fighting for his back-end percentages or negotiating strict limitations on his working hours. He just signed on the dotted line, legally binding himself to a machine that was designed to extract every single ounce of his physical and charismatic capital. The schedule was punishing. It is hard to overstate the physical toll the production of Fame took on its cast, and on Gene in particular, because he was the show's primary kinetic engine. When a scene required a spectacular, gravity-defying leap, they called Gene. When they needed an explosive finale to an episode, they called Gene. A standard week on the MGM lot in Culver City, California, was a masterclass in exploitation. The cast was working 14 to 16-hour days, 5 days a week. They would start at dawn in the makeup chair. They would spend hours acting on sound stages under blistering hot studio lights. But unlike standard actors who could retreat to their trailers between setups, Gene and the dancers had to immediately rush to the rehearsal studios. They had to learn entirely new, complex, athletic choreography for the next episode. There was no time for muscle recovery. There was no time for physical therapy. They were expected to dance on concrete floors, repeating high-impact jumps and splits dozens of times from different camera angles until the director was satisfied. Gene's feet were permanently blistered. His joints ached. He suffered from chronic shin splints. He was physically breaking down, but the production schedule did not care. The show had a delivery date for the network, and the machine could not stop. If he was in pain, they handed him ice packs, strapped his ankles, and pushed him back out in front of the cameras. He was expected to smile, exude that trademark Leroy arrogance, and sweat for the lens. But the television show was only half the grift. The executives quickly realized that the cast could sing as well as they could dance. So they marched them into recording studios on their weekends, their only designated time off. They churned out albums under the moniker The Kids from Fame. These weren't passion projects. They were highly processed commercial products designed to dominate the pop charts. And dominate they did. The records sold in their millions. By 1982, the Fame television series had crossed the Atlantic and hit the United Kingdom. It was broadcast on BBC One, and it didn't just find an audience. It triggered absolute unadulterated hysteria. The UK went mad for Fame. The show regularly pulled in over 11 million viewers. The albums went multi-platinum. Sensing the massive European cash grab, the producers organized live concert tours. They took this exhausted, overworked cast and threw them onto airplanes. In 1982 and 1983, the Kids from Fame toured the UK. It was Beatlemania for the neon generation. When Gene and the cast landed at Heathrow Airport, they were mobbed by thousands of screaming, crying teenagers. Police lines were broken. The cast had to be smuggled out through service elevators. They played a historic sold-out run of shows at the Royal Albert Hall in London. The sheer volume of the screaming inside that legendary venue was deafening. Princess Diana sat in the royal box, completely enthralled. On stage, Gene was the undisputed star. He was the one the crowd screamed for the loudest. He pushed his exhausted, aching body through 2-hour high-octane live performances night after night. He was soaking up the adulation, riding the ultimate high of global superstardom. But behind the screaming crowds in the sold-out arenas lay a grim, infuriating financial reality. Gene Anthony Ray was generating tens of millions of dollars for the corporate entity that owned Fame. His face was on lunchboxes, t-shirts, posters, pencil cases, and trading cards. His voice was on records selling out in Woolworths across Britain. The television syndication rights were being sold globally for fortunes. Yet Gene saw barely a fraction of a penny of it. His ironclad contract kept him on a basic, relatively low episodic salary. He had no merchandising rights. He had no points on the back end of the record sales. The executives sitting in comfortable air-conditioned offices in Los Angeles were getting rich beyond their wildest dreams. Gene, the boy bleeding into his dancing shoes, the boy who actually possessed the talent that drove the entire empire, was effectively a wage laborer. He was a highly visible, globally adored, indentured servant to the television studio. Worse than the financial theft was the complete, utter lack of a safety net. The studio had taken a street-smart but worldly naive teenager from one of the toughest neighborhoods in America and thrust him into the blinding center of global fame. They provided absolutely zero infrastructure to help him survive it. There were no financial advisors assigned to teach him how to handle his wages. There were no psychologists provided to help him process the bizarre, distorting reality of having strangers scream his name and tear at his clothes in the street. There was no one to protect him from the hangers-on, the sycophants, and the predators that naturally gravitate towards young, sudden wealth. They treated him not as a vulnerable young man in need of guidance, but as a piece of heavy machinery. You run the machine at maximum capacity, you perform zero maintenance, and you keep going until the gears inevitably strip and the engine burns out. Gene was entirely alone in a crowded room. He was surrounded by minders, publicists, and producers, but none of them were looking out for his actual well-being. They were only looking at the bottom line. He was expected to navigate the toxic, high-pressure, drug-fueled environment of 1980s celebrity completely blindfolded. The exhaustion was setting in deep into his bones. The physical pain was becoming a constant, dull roar in the background of his life. The machine was squeezing him tighter and tighter, extracting every drop of charisma and physical energy he had left. And as the pressure mounted, Gene began to look for ways to numb the pain. The bright, blinding lights of global fame were casting long, very dark shadows, and he was about to step directly into them. By 1983, the gulf between the man and the myth was widening into a dangerous chasm. Every Thursday evening in the UK, millions of families sat around the telly consuming the perfectly packaged, uplifting struggles of the Fame kids. They saw Leroy Johnson, tough, misunderstood, but ultimately protected by a warm safety net of caring teachers and loyal friends. Leroy always found redemption before the end credits rolled. Leroy always won. Gene Anthony Ray, however, was losing. He was living a violently split existence. In the daylight, he was the smiling, sweating, high-kicking property of MGM television. He belonged to the camera. He was expected to project boundless optimism and street-smart invincibility. But when the studio lights snapped off and the director yelled "cut," Gene was left alone in the deafening silence of his own reality. The adrenaline crash was brutal. He was barely in his 20s, earning money he could never have comprehended a few years prior, yet he was entirely unmoored. The grueling 70-hour work weeks left him physically shattered. His joints throbbed constantly, but the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the psychological isolation. He was surrounded by minders, publicists, and sycophants who wanted a piece of his orbit, but he had no real anchor. The studio executives viewed him as a highly temperamental racehorse. They fed him. They worked him hard, but they did not care about his mind. To survive the sheer, crushing pressure of being a global commodity, Gene needed an escape valve. He found it in the exact place you would expect a wealthy, exhausted young man in the 1980s to look: the nightlife. The club scenes of Los Angeles and New York during this era were entirely unregulated playgrounds. Cocaine was not a dirty secret. It was a currency. It was piled high on glass tables in VIP rooms. For Gene, the clubs offered a temporary reprieve from the suffocating expectations of his wholesome television persona. In the dark, under the strobe lights, he didn't have to be a role model. He didn't have to be Leroy. He could just be Gene. Initially, the drugs and the alcohol were recreational. They were a way to blow off steam after a 14-hour shoot. But the trap of substance abuse rarely snaps shut immediately. It closes slowly. As the physical pain of his punishing dance routines worsened, and as the psychological stress of carrying a multi-million-dollar franchise mounted, the substances morphed from a party favor into a blunt force anesthetic. He wasn't drinking to feel good. He was drinking to stop feeling anything at all. He needed to numb the dissonance. He needed to shut off the part of his brain that knew he was being exploited, underpaid, and worked to the bone by men in suits who wouldn't look twice at a black kid from Harlem if he couldn't make them rich. But the facade completely shattered in 1984. If Gene's life was a fragile house of cards, the events of that year were a hurricane. The one thing Gene held sacred, the true anchor to his humanity before the madness of fame, was his family. Specifically his mother, Jean Ray. She was a formidable woman who had raised him in the unforgiving environment of Harlem. She was his bedrock. In a shocking and devastating police operation, the NYPD executed a massive drug raid. They didn't just target street-level dealers, they took down a highly organized narcotics ring operating directly out of Gene's old neighborhood. The target of that raid was Jean Ray. The authorities arrested his mother, his grandmother, his aunts, and his uncles. They alleged that Gene's family was running a substantial heroin and cocaine distribution network. In a single afternoon, the police systematically dismantled Gene's entire family structure, throwing the people he loved most in the world into holding cells, facing decades in federal prison. The news broke with the subtlety of a bomb. You have to understand the media landscape of 1984. There was no social media to control the narrative. The tabloid press dictated public reality, and the tabloids absolutely feasted on this story. It was the ultimate irresistible contradiction. The squeaky clean, inspirational star of the world's most wholesome television show and his drug kingpin mother facing a massive prison sentence. The headlines were savage. Paparazzi swarmed Gene's home, his sets, his life. They wanted photos of the broken teen idol. For Gene, the bottom fell out of his world. His mother was looking at a minimum of 15 years behind bars. His family was destroyed. The guilt, the terror, and the sheer helplessness he felt were completely paralyzing. This was the moment the true cold-blooded nature of the Hollywood machine revealed itself. A decent employer, an organization with a shred of basic human empathy, would have stopped the production. They would have pulled their 22-year-old star aside, offered him immediate legal and psychological support, and given him a leave of absence to deal with a profound family catastrophe. MGM Television did absolutely none of that. The executives in Los Angeles went into complete panic mode. They did not give a single damn about Gene's mental state or his mother's impending incarceration. They cared exclusively about one thing: the syndication value of fame. They were terrified that advertisers in Middle America and the UK would pull their funding if the show was tainted by a severe real-life drug scandal. The brand was everything. The human being was irrelevant. The studio's response was swift and ruthless. They deployed their high-powered fixers and public relations teams to aggressively kill the story wherever possible and distance the show from the Ray family. But their mandate to Gene was the most psychologically violent act of all. They ordered him to ignore it. They hauled him into the makeup trailer the very next morning at 5 a.m. They sat him in the chair, covered the dark circles under his eyes with heavy foundation, and forced him onto the soundstage. The directive was clear: keep your mouth shut, do not speak to the press, and do your job. They expected him to stand under the hot lights, listen to the upbeat synthesized music, and perform. They demanded that he smile his trademark Leroy smile. They demanded high kicks. They demanded flawless, energetic routines. They forced him to play the role of the happiest, luckiest, most aspirational teenager in the world, while his actual world was burning to ash around him. Imagine that specific brand of torture. Imagine your mother sitting in a freezing cell, stripped of her dignity, facing the destruction of her life. Imagine knowing you are powerless to stop it. Now imagine a director pointing a camera at your face and screaming, "Action! Give me more energy, Gene. Bigger smile." It broke him. It fundamentally and permanently fractured his psyche. The human mind cannot sustain that level of compartmentalization. You cannot artificially separate a soul-crushing trauma from your physical reality without something snapping. The cognitive dissonance of being Leroy on screen and a terrified, grieving son off screen was impossible to bear. He was performing a grotesque pantomime of joy. Every time he leaped into the air on that set, it was a lie. Every time he smiled for a promotional photo, it tasted like ash. He was surrounded by a cast and crew who were explicitly instructed not to mention the incident. He was living inside a silent, corporate-mandated vacuum where his mother's existence was suddenly erased for the sake of television ratings. With no support system, no therapy, and a studio actively forcing him to bury his trauma, Gene took the only exit available to him. He completely surrendered to the numbness. The occasional nightclub use escalated into a desperate, daily dependency. He needed alcohol to sleep. He needed cocaine to wake up and face the makeup chair. He needed pills to dull the anxiety that constantly clawed at his chest. The drugs were no longer a symptom of fame. They were the only mechanism keeping him tethered to the earth. He was drinking and using with a terrifying, self-destructive urgency. He was trying to kill the pain, but in the process, he was slowly, methodically killing himself. The executives watched him deteriorate. They saw the bloodshot eyes. They noticed the missed rehearsals and the erratic behavior. They knew exactly why he was spiraling. But as long as he could hit his marks, when the red light on the camera turned on, they looked the other way. They kept the cameras rolling, capturing the hollowed-out shell of a genius, entirely indifferent to the tragedy unfolding right in front of them. Hollywood operates on a very specific, ruthless currency, the fantasy. In the early 1980s, the entertainment industry had an ironclad, unwritten rule book regarding its male stars. If your face was printed on the glossy pages of smash hits or Tiger Beat, if your posters were pinned to the bedroom walls of millions of teenage girls across the globe, you were straight. There was absolutely no room for debate. There was no gray area. You were the ultimate unattainable boyfriend. You were rugged, you were virile, and you were strictly interested in women. This was the product MGM Television was selling. And Gene Anthony Ray, the undisputed breakout heartthrob of the Fame franchise, was their prime asset. But it was a complete fabricated lie. Gene Anthony Ray was gay. Within his tight-knit inner circle, among his fellow dancers in the New York theater scene, it wasn't a heavily guarded state secret. It was simply a fact of his existence. He had a meticulous, flamboyant personal style. He possessed a sharp camp wit. When he wasn't wearing the baggy tracksuits dictated by the wardrobe department, he dressed with a fastidious, vibrant flair that hinted at his true self to anyone who knew how to read the signals. But to the general public, to the millions of girls screaming his name outside the Royal Albert Hall, to the conservative studio executives holding the purse strings, he could not say a single word. He was locked inside a suffocating, corporate-mandated closet. You have to grasp the sheer terror of being a closeted gay man in the public eye during the Reagan era. It was not a time of progressive understanding. It was an era of intense, aggressive homophobia. The media was vicious. The tabloids actively hunted for scandals to destroy careers. If a male teen idol was outed in 1983, it wasn't just a PR crisis, it was an execution. The studio would have dropped him immediately. The syndication deals in conservative markets would have vanished overnight. The merchandising empire would have collapsed. Gene knew this. The executives knew this. And so, a silent, brutal pact was formed. Gene would keep his mouth shut, and the studio would keep paying him. But the psychological toll of maintaining that facade was excruciating. Imagine living every single day of your life conducting a meticulous, exhausting threat assessment. Every time Gene stepped out of his front door, he was performing. He had to constantly monitor his body language. He had to police the inflection of his voice. He had to ensure his wrists weren't too loose, his walk wasn't too rhythmic, his reactions weren't too theatrical. He was a man naturally bursting with expressive energy, deliberately forcing himself into a rigid, artificial box of conventional masculinity. The press junkets were practically interrogations. Journalists, always hungry for a scoop, would constantly probe his personal life. They would thrust microphones into his face and ask leading, intrusive questions. Who are you dating, Gene? Are you looking for a wife? What do you look for in a girl? He had to lie. He had to invent phantom girlfriends. He had to smile charmingly and deliver carefully rehearsed, evasive answers. He had to sit next to his female co-stars and feign romantic chemistry for the cameras, knowing the entire time it was a hollow pantomime. It is a unique kind of psychological violence to force a human being to publicly deny their own fundamental nature day after day, year after year. It creates a profound self-hatred. When the world constantly tells you that your true self is disgusting, unmarketable, and career-destroying, a part of you begins to believe it. Gene was an icon to millions, yet he was utterly terrified of his own truth. He was living as a ghost inside his own wildly successful life. The studio sets of Culver City and the luxury hotels of international press tours were gilded cages. They were sterile, closely monitored environments where the lie had to be maintained at all costs. So Gene sought refuge in the only place he could finally breathe. He went underground. When the sun went down and the studio handlers finally clocked off, Gene vanished into the vibrant, pulsating shadow world of New York's gay club scene. Places like the Paradise Garage or the sprawling, dark dance floors of the West Village became his sanctuary. This wasn't just about partying. This was about survival. Inside those heavy, soundproof doors, the oppressive rules of Hollywood evaporated. Under the strobe lights, surrounded by the heavy, driving thump of house and disco music, Gene didn't have to be Leroy Johnson, the straight teen idol. He could drop the heavy armor of masculinity. He could dance the way he actually wanted to dance. He could speak freely. He could flirt without looking over his shoulder for a tabloid photographer. In the underground club, surrounded by his own community, he found a fleeting, desperate kind of freedom. It was the only space where his immense fame didn't dictate his identity. It was a lifeline. He clung to this nocturnal world because it was the only place he felt truly, authentically human. But this sanctuary held a terrifying, invisible threat. The timeline is tragically precise. Gene's peak years of fame, his desperate need for authentic connection, and his immersion into the underground gay scene perfectly coincided with the dawn of the darkest chapter in modern medical history. It was the early 1980s. A strange, unnamed whisper was beginning to move through the clubs. Young, perfectly healthy men were suddenly dropping dead. They were developing rare skin cancers. They were suffocating from aggressive pneumonias. At first, it was just rumors, a friend of a friend who got sick and vanished. Then it was a dancer he knew. Then it was a choreographer. The mainstream media largely ignored it. When they did report on it, the language was cruel and dismissive. They called it the gay plague. The government, under Ronald Reagan, refused to even say the word publicly for years, let alone fund proper research or public health campaigns. There was no internet to spread awareness. There were no definitive tests. There was only panic, stigma, and a rapidly climbing death toll. The gay community was abandoned. They were left to die in the dark. And in that dark, seeking the love and connection that his public life expressly forbade, Gene Anthony Ray contracted HIV. It is the most devastating, cruel irony of his entire story. The fame machine forced him into a closet. The pressure of that closet drove him into the underground. And in the underground, looking for a brief moment of truth in a life built entirely on corporate lies, he was handed a death sentence. He didn't know it immediately. For a long time, the virus was silent, but the time bomb was ticking. He was carrying an immense, fatal secret inside his body. Underneath the bravado, the reality was terrifying. He was a young, closeted black man in America, entirely alone, deeply addicted to narcotics to numb the trauma of his mother's incarceration, carrying a virus that the world viewed as a filthy, shameful death sentence. The trap had completely closed. The sheer blinding energy that had captivated the globe was about to be systematically dismantled from the inside out. The human body is an incredibly resilient machine, but it has strict, non-negotiable limits. For a dancer, the body is the entire instrument. By the mid-1980s, Gene Anthony Ray's instrument was under siege. The virus he had contracted in the shadows was no longer dormant, and it was systematically dismantling his immune system, leaving the door wide open for opportunistic infections. The first signs were subtle, easily brushed off, as the natural consequences of the brutal television production schedule. He was chronically fatigued. His joints, already battered from years of dancing on unforgiving studio floors, began to ache with a new, sharper intensity. Then the weight loss started. Gene had always been lean, built like a whippet, composed entirely of fast-twitch muscle fibers. But the weight he was losing now was muscle wasting. His face, previously defined by those striking, arrogant cheekbones that the camera loved, began to look genuinely gaunt. The vibrant, healthy glow faded, replaced by a pallid gray undertone. It was an open secret on the MGM lot. The whispers echoed through the sound stages. People noticed the terrible racking coughs that he tried to stifle between takes. They noticed his energy, once a terrifying, untamed force of nature, was now something he had to manually crank up just before the director shouted action. Instead of compassion, the corporate machine deployed cosmetics and cover-ups. The daily routine in the makeup trailer became a grotesque exercise in illusion. Makeup artists painted the picture of a healthy, vibrant teenager onto the canvas of a gravely ill man, using heavy bronzers and aggressive contouring to artificially fill out the hollows in his cheeks. The grueling machinery of the television production demanded absolute consistency. He continued to put on the oversized tracksuits, a deliberate wardrobe choice that shifted from a fashion statement to a desperate attempt to hide his rapidly shrinking frame. The explosive, gravity-defying choreography that had defined his early career became a physical impossibility. Every routine was a brutal negotiation with his failing body. He had to reach deep into a physical well that was completely dry, scraping together just enough energy to give the camera the illusion of vitality it required. The directors and choreographers, fully aware of his deterioration, simply modified the routines. They relied heavily on upper body movements, changed camera angles, and placed him further back in the ensemble formations. They were actively hiding his physical weakness in plain sight rather than halting production. Gene was forced to march onto a brightly lit soundstage, listen to upbeat pop music, and pretend to be the energetic king of the school while in physical agony. It was a profound violation of human dignity, literally working him to death and squeezing the final drops of profitable charisma from a man who was visibly fighting a losing battle for his life. By 1987, the facade could no longer hold. The virus was winning. Gene's immune system was in tatters. He was missing days of work not because he was out partying, but because he physically could not drag himself out of bed. The opportunistic infections were taking hold. The exhaustion was absolute. He was a ghost haunting his own television show. The producers had finally reached their limit, but it wasn't a limit of empathy, it was a limit of convenience. Gene was no longer reliable. He was costing them money and production delays. The product was becoming defective. So they cut him loose, but they didn't just quietly let his contract expire. They didn't issue a respectful press release citing health reasons to protect his dignity. That would have required acknowledging the terrifying reality of AIDS, a word the Wholesome Fame franchise wanted absolutely nothing to do with. Instead, the studio executed a ruthless, calculated character assassination. They fired Gene Anthony Ray and fed a vicious, fabricated narrative directly to the tabloid press. They told the world that he was being let go due to extreme unprofessionalism. They painted a picture of a spoiled, erratic diva. They heavily implied that his absences and his weight loss were entirely due to rampant drug abuse and an out-of-control party lifestyle. It was the perfect cynical cover story. The public already knew about his rough background. They remembered the highly publicized arrest of his mother a few years prior. The narrative of the troubled, drug-addicted street kid throwing his life away was incredibly easy to sell. The press swallowed it whole and printed it without asking a single real question. The executives at MGM knowingly, deliberately destroyed Gene's professional reputation to protect their brand. They took a young man who was dying of a stigmatized disease, a man who had made them millions of dollars and broken his body for their profit, and they threw him entirely under the bus. They branded him a liability, a junkie, and a failure. They ensured that he would struggle to ever find meaningful work in the industry again. They stripped him of his health. They stripped him of his wealth. And finally, as he walked out of the studio gates for the last time, they systematically stripped him of his dignity. The silence that followed was absolute. The machine simply replaced him, recalibrated, and kept right on running, leaving Gene completely alone to face the dark. There is a specific, terrifying silence that occurs when the entertainment industry decides it is finished with you. It is not a gradual fading out. It is the brutal, sudden severing of an artery. For Gene Anthony Ray, the transition from global superstar to industry pariah happened practically overnight. When MGM Television fired him and fed the narrative of his unprofessionalism to the press, they didn't just end his contract. They effectively blacklisted him. They painted a massive invisible target on his back. Imagine his reality the morning after the news broke. For the better part of a decade, his life had been micromanaged down to the minute. He had publicists telling him where to stand, drivers waiting outside his door, and directors shouting his name. His entire existence was validated by the constant chaotic noise of production and the deafening roar of adoration. Then he woke up, and the phone simply did not ring. The sycophants, the hangers-on, the industry friends who happily drank his champagne in the VIP rooms of New York and Los Angeles evaporated into thin air. In Hollywood, proximity to power is everything, but proximity to failure is a contagious disease. Gene was now radioactive. He was a branded liability with a reputation for drug abuse, erratic behavior, and declining health. No casting director was going to risk their production budget on him. No studio was going to insure him. But the silence of the industry was only the first blow. The second, more devastating reality was the financial collapse. To the outside world, the equation seemed simple. Gene Anthony Ray was the face of a multi-million-dollar global franchise. Therefore, Gene Anthony Ray must be a millionaire. The public assumed he was retreating to a mansion in the Hollywood Hills to lick his wounds. The truth was grotesque. Gene had generated unimaginable wealth for the corporation, but his predatory contracts meant he had kept practically none of it. He had no back-end points on the syndication deals. He received no royalties from the mountains of fame merchandise. He was paid a standard episodic fee, and a significant portion of that had already been drained. It had been spent on the punishing legal fees, trying to defend his mother and family during their drug trafficking trials. It had been spent on the exorbitant lifestyle expected of a young star. And tragically, it had been spent on the narcotics he used to cope with the sheer psychological trauma of his existence. When the fame paycheck stopped, there was no safety net. There was no severance package. There was no vast investment portfolio waiting to catch him. He was suddenly an unemployed 20-something high school dropout with a highly specialized, physically demanding skill set and a body that was rapidly breaking down. This is where the brutal reality of the American healthcare system collided with his terrifying diagnosis. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, an HIV diagnosis was not just a medical crisis, it was a financial death sentence. When the first antiretroviral drug, AZT, finally hit the market, it was priced at an extortionate rate. It was the most expensive drug in medical history at the time, costing thousands of dollars a year. Gene did not have corporate health insurance anymore. He did not have the cash reserves to fight a protracted, expensive medical battle. He was a global cultural icon who had danced for royalty, yet he found himself entirely unable to afford basic, life-saving medical care in the richest country on earth. He had to watch his own body deteriorate, knowing that the treatments that might buy him time were locked behind a paywall he could no longer breach. Desperation is a powerful motivator. Gene refused to just lay down and die. He tried to fight his way back, but every avenue was blocked by the stigma of his fabricated reputation and his failing health. He looked across the Atlantic. Fame had been a colossal hit in Europe, particularly in Italy. The Italian public adored Leroy Johnson. They didn't care about the Hollywood gossip. They just remembered the energy. So Gene packed his bags and fled to Milan. It wasn't a triumphant international tour. It was a desperate exile. He was running out of options in America, hoping to trade on the lingering European nostalgia for his character. He attempted to establish a dance school in Italy. The concept made sense on paper. Learn to dance with the star of fame. But Gene was a brilliant, instinctual artist, not a businessman. He had no experience in running a company, managing overheads, or marketing an institution. Furthermore, his health was wildly unpredictable. The virus was taking a heavier toll every month. The energy required to teach, to demonstrate those explosive routines simply wasn't there anymore. The Italian venture collapsed. It was a humiliating, expensive failure that drained what little resources he had left. He was forced to return to the United States. The return was not a homecoming. It was a surrender. By the early 1990s, the cultural memory of fame was fading, replaced by the grunge era and a new generation of stars. Gene was a relic of a neon decade that the industry had actively discarded. He scraped the bottom of the barrel for work. He took demeaning, low-paying gigs on cruise ships, trying to entertain tourists who vaguely recognized his face. It is a profound, specific kind of heartbreak to watch a man who once commanded the stage at the Royal Albert Hall forced to do watered-down routines on a Lido deck just to pay for his groceries. There were brief, fleeting moments of hope, usually provided by the very few people who actually cared about him. Debbie Allen, his former Fame co-star, who played the formidable dance teacher Lydia Grant, was one of the rare individuals who did not abandon him. She was a powerhouse in her own right, moving into directing and producing. In 1995, she directed a film called Out of Sync and gave Gene a cameo role. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. But when you look at the footage of Gene in that film, it is deeply shocking. The muscular, arrogant, vibrant Leroy is entirely gone. The man on screen is fragile. He is hollowed out. His face is gaunt. His eyes lack the old dangerous spark, and his physical presence is radically diminished. He looks exactly like what he was, a man losing a grinding attritional war against a lethal disease. The industry saw that footage too. If there was ever any chance of a Hollywood comeback, that cameo killed it. He looked visibly ill, and in an industry entirely obsessed with youth and vitality, visible illness is the ultimate, unforgivable sin. The final descent was rapid and horrifying. The money completely vanished. The medical bills piled up into insurmountable mountains of debt. The man whose face had launched 1 million leg warmers, the boy who had dragged himself out of the Harlem projects through sheer undeniable genius, hit absolute concrete rock bottom. He lost his accommodation. Gene Anthony Ray, a global television icon, became homeless. He spent nights sleeping on public park benches in New York City. He was back on the exact same brutal streets he had escaped from over a decade earlier. Only this time, he wasn't a young, fiercely energetic teenager with the world at his feet. He was an exhausted, desperately ill man in his 30s, shivering in the cold, entirely ignored by the city that had once worshipped his talent. He was eventually forced into the ultimate indignity, moving back in with his mother. Jean Ray had served her time. She was out of federal prison, but she was a convicted felon trying to survive in a dilapidated, cramped apartment in a rough neighborhood. Gene, ravaged by AIDS, stripped of his dignity, and entirely broke, had to crawl back to the very family structure that the media had used to crucify him. He spent his final years sleeping on his mother's sofa or couch surfing in the cramped, tiny apartments of the few loyal friends who hadn't turned their backs on him. The machine had completed its cycle. It had taken a brilliant, rough diamond from the street. It had cut him, polished him, and sold him to the world for a fortune. It had wrung every ounce of physical energy and cultural capital out of his body. And when he was broken, sick, and no longer profitable, it casually tossed him back into the gutter. He was entirely erased from the corporate narrative of fame. The syndication checks kept rolling in for the executives. The nostalgia documentaries were made. But the human being who powered it all was left to rot in obscurity, paying the ultimate fatal price for the industry's greed. The physical suffering finally ended in the winter of 2003. Gene Anthony Ray suffered a severe stroke in June of that year. It was a catastrophic blow to a body already ravaged by a quiet, decade-long battle with HIV/AIDS. He never fully recovered. On November 14, 2003, in Manhattan, the exact same city that had birthed him, elevated him, and ultimately discarded him, he died from complications of the virus. He was just 41 years old. There was no grand Hollywood funeral. The entertainment industry did not stop to mourn. The corporate machines that had built empires on his sweat offered little more than a polite, brief footnote in the trade papers. The fame machine had long since moved on to newer, younger, more profitable models. But Gene's true legacy does not belong to the executives who exploited him. It belongs to the culture he permanently shifted. Gene Anthony Ray took the raw, unfiltered rhythm of the Harlem streets and forced the global establishment to respect it. Before him, mainstream screen dancing was largely confined to polite, classical choreography or highly polished Broadway routines. Gene shattered that mold entirely. He brought visceral, aggressive emotion to the television screen. He proved that you did not need a formal, expensive education to be a genius. He gave an entire generation of working-class kids who felt invisible, permission to express their anger, their joy, and their existence through movement. Leroy Johnson was the fictional avatar, but Gene Anthony Ray was the actual, undeniable fire. Yet his life story stands as a brutal, necessary warning. It is the ultimate indictment of a celebrity apparatus that operates without a moral compass. Gene was a pioneer who broke down racial and class barriers in media, yet the system treated him as a disposable, depreciating asset. He generated millions for corporations, yet died relying on the charity of friends. He was worshipped by millions globally, yet he was forced by bigotry to hide his true self, dying in the shadow of a deeply prejudiced era. When we look back at the neon aesthetics and the phenomenal energy of the 1980s, we cannot simply consume the nostalgia blindfolded. We owe it to Gene to remember the human cost of that era's entertainment. We must look past the iconic high-kicking character of Leroy Johnson. We must see the real kid from Harlem who gave the world absolutely everything he had until the world left him with nothing. He danced his heart out just to survive. He deserved an industry and a society that did not demand his life as the price of his ticket.